Um, Rob and I were asked to do some research into international case studies in on design codes and to see what some of the lessons were. Um, we thought we'd include some of Rob's famous cartoons. I mean, you can't really have a have Rob doing a presentation without having some of his fantastic humour, and I sprinkled a couple through the slides as we go. So, just a bit about the background. Yeah, so we did this last year. Um, we looked at 12 case studies. That was whittled down from a long list of about 20 or more that we were recommended to us, suggested to us, and we found online. Um, and we was researching into a number of topics that Office Supplies wanted us to cover. And the topics were they wanted urban growth, they wanted residential codes, but they also wanted to look at things like out of town retail. Were there any codes covering that? Codes for commercial industrial areas, street and public realm codes, and authority wide codes. And we managed to cover most of those headings, although, as you'll see, they were not equally spread across that range of topics. And in particular, what we were looking for was what was the evidence that those codes had, first of all, helped improve design, secondly, helped make design more popular locally with local people and residents who live there, and could these codes provide any kind of lesson that we might apply to planning, specifically in England? The issue of popular design was quite problematic for us in terms of the research, because of course within the time scale and resources available, we weren't in any position to undertake any real surveys of people living in these areas. What we did was we took the public consultation that had been carried out, and used that as a proxy for the popularity of the design codes. And what we found actually was surprising, that there was very little consultation that was actually done with the wider general public, and we'll cover some of the exceptions to that when we look at the presentation. We're going to show a sample of those dozen case studies and just focus on what some of the salient points were for each of those. And we're going to end up with the 10 lessons that we drew from that research. So these were the shortlisted codes that we covered. As you can see, they cover the Middle East, Australia, Ireland, and Europe, New Zealand. Quite a few from New Zealand, and we were quite impressed by those. We liked them quite a lot. Oman, and also a couple from the USA. Although there were a lot more examples from the USA we could have included, but we wanted to give a fairly good spread. So I'm going to hand over to Rob, who's going to just say a bit more about the background of our research and start talking about some of the first case studies. Rob, over to you.
Yeah, we looked at the international planning systems a bit, because obviously design codes happen within the context of government, and in a way our conclusion was that if you want design codes to work, don't have a planning system like the UK's, because a lot of the international design codes we looked at were in the context of a planning system that is itself regulatory and prescriptive and not discretionary like the UK's. So you create a code, and that's very much based in the international in the policy of that the government or the local government, which helps a lot. In addition to that, in particularly European countries, local authorities often took the initiatives, so they would buy the site, put in the infrastructure, draw up a master plan, draw up design codes, in a way that's much less common in this country. So the local authority was in control and producing a design code with teeth. Yeah, should we go on to the next slide?
Yep.
We're in a small town, 50,000 people in the state of in Washington State, USA. It was interesting that this was one of the few codes that we looked at that wasn't particularly well designed, but it was also particularly prescriptive in terms of the form of architecture. So it said, this is the sort of architecture we want. These are, for example, here, slope roofs, strong eave line. But particularly they specified, we want the architecture of the early 20th century. And they had consultation which came up with that, and visual preference surveys, which were and are a common way of consulting people about design codes. I think, that they can be misused, because visual preference surveys are a matter of showing people photographs of existing places and buildings and saying what you like. And well, it depends on what you show them as to what they're going to say. You can predict pretty easily what they're going to like and dislike. So I think that's got to be used carefully. On the next one. Next slide.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, San Jose. We looked at two codes. One for the downtown, which was a very elaborate, very professional, beautifully illustrated guide to making the design the downtown more pedestrian friendly, with a better public realm. And with prescriptive standards that development has to keep. But particularly interesting was also the San Jose citywide guidelines, which related to a lot of types of development which often aren't covered by a design guide. So things like filling stations and car braking yards, and things that you'd think, well, these are never going to create good urbanism. But this guide was saying, well, they should, whatever it is, R&D, warehouses, however unurban it might seem. Actually, we can come up with, we can code some standards that development should follow. And if it's not going to turn into good urbanism immediately, well, over the years, it might do if we have these standards. So it was interesting to see that very wide range of building types. Next slide. Interestingly, the guides said very little about how they consulted the community. San Jose did. It talked a bit about its community workshops, but it seemed that it was quite difficult to tell how much public input there was, and there was clearly a lot of professional input, and most of the codes that we looked at really reflected international experience of good practice, and in their very long and beautifully illustrated, often reports, they didn't really feel the need to tell the story of what the process was of how these were developed, and how the professionals and the stakeholders and the public work together. And I think that's something that in the UK we're much stronger on. Next slide. Not a lot of codes did covered retrofit, but Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates did. They started. They originally their highway standards were based on American models, and they decided that that wasn't good enough, and they commissioned a very elaborate. They brought in the best European urban designers and design coders and came up with a design code that would challenge the very car-based highway system in Abu Dhabi that has led to enormous health problems of nobody walking anywhere. And have come up with a code that really tries to make it a pedestrian friendly place. It's very hot a lot of the time, but it's in certain places and certain times it's not too hot to walk. But then they did their first code, and then they looked at it and they thought, well, actually, if we want to make pedestrian friendly places, there are some already, which are the existing traditional streets that previously they hadn't been interested in, but they realized actually this is good urbanism. So they describe in their code 3 different steps of intervention, decluttering, improvements to the pedestrian realm, or in some cases, the total recreation of the street, but came up with a very interesting code as to how to do that. Next slide.
Yeah, I'll take over for on the next one. One thing I add to that is that I think this is a good example where a code is reflecting the sort of the cultural environment of the place that it's been drawn for, and in particular with the street design, there is a sense that the designers recognize quite consciously that where attitudes were for drivers and pedestrians, and so there's no inclusion of things like shared surfaces or so-called naked streets, with removing of signage and that kind of thing, because of the recognition that the local people and users just weren't ready for that yet. One other really interesting thing about the Abu Dhabi, though, example was that they developed this incredible online tool, which is really quite impressive. This is free to use. You can access it. I've put the link on the slide, and play around with it. And what it does is it allows you to basically configure any street using the components that are part and specified in the design code. So you can put in the footways, you can put in street trees, you can street lighting, you can put in as many or as few car lanes as you decide. You can add in things like public transport. There's a panel on the right-hand side. You can drag and drop the different things like bus stops. It even tells you about the sort of shade and watering requirements needed for the landscaping. So it's really quite a comprehensive, sophisticated tool, the likes of which I've not seen anywhere else in the world, and it outputs both a plan and section, so you can spit that out in CAD format or graphic format, so you can use it in your own local master plans or designs. So it's definitely worth having a look at that and a play around with it. We looked at a whole number of codes for Australia and New Zealand, and I think in many ways there are similarities, but also big differences to UK practice. So the Western Australia design code, it comes in 2 volumes. Volume 1 covers detached houses, basically, of which most Australian suburbs are fairly characterized by often single or 2-story detached properties set within their own plot. And then volume 2 covers apartment houses and mixed-use buildings with residential upper floors. And what was really interesting was 2 things. First of all, for volume 1, which is the individual private residential houses, there's a deemed to comply consent if you meet all the requirements of the code. So you've got your consent. In fact, you don't even need to tell your neighbour that you're going to go ahead and do this. You're granted permission automatically. If you don't meet all of the code requirements, or if you have an innovative way of exceeding the code requirements, then it goes to a design panel, and that's it's also the way that the approach for volume 2, which covers the mixed use and apartment buildings and higher density buildings, where the assumption is these are more likely done by professional architects and designed rather than by a local builder. So the non-compliant proposals go before a design panel, and they decide whether or not the scheme meets the the objectives of the design code and more guidance related supporting narrative for it. Now, it's really clear that the main purpose of these kind of codes is, particularly for the Volume 1, is to streamline the planning process rather than to promote good design. And in fact, similar codes are used in a number of Australian states, and they're controversial because some of the requirements aren't particularly demanding. For instance, garden sizes, the minimum garden size is tiny. You can effectively build on a very large percentage of your plot. New South Wales is going further even, and I think it was announced just a week ago that it was I think it reported in the Architects Journal, latest edition, that they're introducing a pattern book approach, and they've done a competition that sought schemes that'll be made as patterns that people can then apply and get to deem consent for buildings, including apartment buildings and houses. So interesting to see the direction of travel that it's going. The Vinegar Lane scheme is in New Zealand, and this is actually one of my favourite codes for a number of reasons. First of all, the background to this code is that there's a supermarket, which is you see the inset plan at the top right, the white square on the bottom left. There is the supermarket site. The pink is the site that they disposed of, surplus to requirement, former car park. And basically it was divided into 31 individual lots, which were sold on a freehold basis with land covenants. And what makes this really interesting, I think, is that the land covenants and the setup of a residents association meant that the residents who moved in there and built their homes to this design code have quite a lot of say in terms of how this code is administered. They jointly with the developer and which is the supermarket, and the local council, set up a design panel of mostly professionals who will advise on how well proposals meet the code requirements, and the Residents Association then sign off on whether or not this should go and get permission. So they have quite a lot of authority within that process in terms of how designs come forward and are then submitted to Auckland Council for formal planning permission. I think there's a lot of really interesting sort of aspects to how this code was drawn up, and the focus of the code is really on creating coherent urban block form. So it covers things like floor area ratio, covers height and massing, street interface and setback, the provision for private open space, access parking services, and some guidance on materials. But overall, they're really promoting differentiation and variety within this. So you get you get effectively 31 different solutions to how to make a compact, dense, mixed-use urban environment. There's a code for Oman, which was interesting in a number of ways, produced by British architects Alison Morrison. They did a lot of research into traditional Islamic building patterns, and that informed the code. But one of the things that I just wanted to highlight here is the way that they've then produced summary pages on a plot basis. So basically, we've got all this detailed code guidance, but for each plot, if you're a developer for that plot, you're told exactly where you can build, how much of this needs to be public realm, what the interface between the building and the public realm is, what are the rules for utilities, the height and massing, car parking, and so on. And I think this is a really sort of interesting approach. I've not seen this done many other places. One example I have seen it before is one I've been working on, which is a Graven Hill outside Bicester, where they have a thing they call plot passports, which does a very similar thing to help streamline the process for self-builders. But it's certainly a good way of actually communicating and bringing together all the different rules into a simplified, easy to understand form. So we've got quite a glut of Australasian schemes here. So Hobsonville Point is another New Zealand one. This was interesting for a number of reasons, but a couple I'm going to flag up. First of all, one of the things that we think found was fairly low played in most of the codes, and probably true that it's not given enough attention in UK codes, is the whole issue of sort of the landscape, particularly in residential areas. This code for Hobsonville Point was really strong in terms of the requirements for landscaping, not just in the public realm, but in the frontal plots forward of the building line. And it was really specific about not just the requirement for planting and species and so on, but in terms of making sure that plants had enough soil and irrigation and so on, so they have a really good chance of surviving and thriving. And timescales and maintenance are also stipulated in the code. Another aspect to it, which I think is a useful lesson, was that it's designed as a living document. So, and this was true of quite a few of the codes, that there was built into the code from the outset the requirements for when you'd review and update the code, at what points in time or at what points in the build out of the development. This was, I think, is one of our key lessons that we drew from codes, from good practice in codes, that you could definitely apply in the UK. We did, as part of the research, I would say, we did some interviews with some of the design teams, just 2 or 3 of them, and we spoke to Katja Letts, who was part of the client team for Hobsonville Point, and she made a number of really interesting observations, and including, she said that the process and the application of the code were every bit as important as what was in the code itself, and that more attention needs to be paid when you prepare a code to who's going to be applying it and how it's going to be applied. And the second thing was that as a living document, you need to learn as you go, and that what they found was that in the early iterations of the code, there was a lot of attention to very detailed things, which didn't make so much impact on the actual outcomes, and that they learned to focus much more on the urban design and street scene issues, frontage, setbacks from streets, height and massing, and so on. The other thing that is interesting about this code is, again, as we've seen on some of the others I've mentioned, the code was set up and to be used in conjunction with a design panel. So there's a code and actually a supporting design guide, and the code sets out the real measurable objective requirements, parameters for design. The guide sets out the much less easily defined character and quality issues, and a design panel makes its assessment on whether or not individual designs coming forward actually meet with the ambitions of the guidance and conform to the requirements of the code. And I think that's an interesting way that they've been able to combine and structure their guidance around the need to both say what you must do and what you'd be quite good if you could do. I'm going to bring us now to some of the lessons. Bring Rob back in now, and between us we'll go through what we thought were 10 of the most important issues that you could apply on codes that we're doing in this country.
Well, the first issue, as we said, was design codes work well when they're part of a system with higher order area and city plans. So, which means that in this country, design codes need to be based on planning policy. Otherwise, they're not going to work. Illustrations and diagrams make design codes more accessible and usable. There's some things you can code without drawing them, but if you really want to have them as a workable document that a whole range of different people who need to understand them are going to be able to work with, you need to illustrate them well. The design codes should.
So I was just going to add on to that. I mean, I think also a lot of design codes are going to be read by other designers, architects, landscape architects, and so on. And they like to see things in a visual way. I think it just communicates more directly with them, and subliminally as well. I think the quality of some of the illustrations on some of the design codes shows that people are serious about wanting to raise design standards.
And we're also trying to tell a story. So number three, a design code should set out design principles. So not just a series of things that you need to follow, but we need to explain, what are the principles behind this? Why are we doing that? And how do those principles come from an understanding of that particular place? And some of the codes we looked at didn't actually tell that story. You thought, well, yeah, this looks like a manual of earned design good practice, but how does it relate to this particular place? Number four, a design code can help empower citizens and deliver more popular design and give communities a formal role. Again, the idea is that there's a whole load of the process of developing ideas about a site involves a whole range of different people. And one of the ideas of the design code is to get that discussion up front and to get it written down in the design code. So you don't have to keep going back with every development to come up with the same issues. So it's a way of settling the issues and getting people, citizens involved in that in an early stage.
Yeah, I think it's interesting how many of the codes, the actual code requirements came from generic best practice rather than from a real research and understanding of what had worked locally in the past. A lot of them were inherited rules that have come from previous policy and guidance and so on, but there wasn't that real in-depth questioning or challenging of what actually the rules should say. They were just accepted as being a good approach.
Five, a lot of the codes we looked at were enormous and very beautifully produced documents, but it was quite difficult to see, and they might be called design codes or standards or regulations, but it's quite difficult to tell the difference between guidance and what we would call a code. And in some cases, we heard that the developers had said, well, thanks very much for this 220-page beautifully illustrated urban design document, but what's actually important? Could you put it on one side of one piece of paper? And generally the plans would say, yeah, we could send you a 1 page of A4 with saying what's really important. And you think, well, it would have been useful to do that in the first place. So there are some things in a code that can be adjudicated on by someone with no design training, because if it says the building should be 5 stories, it doesn't take an excellent urban designer to count the stories. There are other things that do need expert judgment. They're in the code, but we need to think, well, does this keep to the code or not? And there's other things that are design guidance, which aren't very specific, and where it's a matter of opinion, and someone has to take a discretionary decision as to whether this is in the spirit of the code or the design guidance.
I think so. I just come in there and just add it was very interesting. Australian, New Zealand examples, the degree to which they relied on having a design panel, design review panel. Obviously, familiar things in this country, but the coupling together of design codes and design review on a formal basis is, I think, a really interesting approach, and it addresses just that issue in terms of what's really clear-cut, measurable code requirements and what's more looser guidance. It also deals with the issues about what happens if you've got someone who's being really innovative and creative and wanting to surpass the standards set out in the code and do something they consider even better. How do you actually allow for that possibility, but still have a way of objectively assessing it? So those were, I think, interesting things which could be fairly easily bolted into UK design code practice.
And 6, they should be living documents subject to regular review. And this is the really tricky thing about design codes. You're putting stuff in what you think is a definitive prescriptive form, and then by the time it's back from the printers, conditions have changed. So how do you cope with that? How do you make it a living document? And there is good practice as how you can try and do that. But being specific, number 7, block and data sheets can be used with design codes to help manage the delivery of complex phase development. As Marcus was saying, these very specific documents can make it easy for people who are developing a particular site to see what's important about that site, what relates to that site, what design, what guidance and codes are, being very specific. Design codes have the potential to streamline simpler planning applications by offering fast-track approval for compliant planning proposals. If it's not discretionary, if it is prescriptive, if it's clear as to what you can build, then there's no reason not to have a fast-track approval process.
Although the devil's in the detail, which is in terms of, for instance, the Western Australia example, if you don't require the right things, then you might get something that happens pretty quickly and people have no great barriers to putting up a new building. But is it going to be to the quality that you're really wanting to? How do you raise the quality on something like that?
Yeah, and it is all difficult because because things are changing. A training program, yes, lots of people, need to understand the code, need to use the code, need to work with it. So a training program can make that happen. And there's some good examples, a few good examples of that, some in this country as well. And Marcus talked about the landscape aspects. Well, it's tempting not to say anything about the landscape in the code because it needs maintenance, it needs conditions to grow, it needs all complicated things that might be quite difficult to code. But if the landscape is important to the quality of the urban design, which it almost always is, then let's think about how you put that into the code.
So that brings us to the end of our quick trot through some of these. We'd be really interested, as obviously we want to hear any questions that people have, but we'd also be really interested to know what experience anybody joining today has of doing design codes internationally. We know we've got people from quite a few places around the globe, so we'd be fascinated to hear. Maybe your experience is quite different to what we've gleaned from the codes that we looked at.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for the really interesting and comprehensive presentation. Could I make a start with one question that I had, and then we can open up to everyone else? I was really interested about the support in the production of the design codes. As you know, we have the National Modern Design Code. And I was wondering, in any countries that you explored, if there is any similar guidance, any support, anything we can learn from on that side?
I don't think we found anything quite like that. I mean, the support in this country is in terms of guidance, in terms of training, funding. But I think the push for design codes as being certainly for area-wide local authority design codes was coming from central government, whereas just about all of the design codes that we looked at have come from developers or city authorities. There were some differences. I think the Abu Dhabi one is a national code. I don't know, Rob, did you come across anything that came at a national level or had that sort of backing?
Not really, but I suppose because the planning systems tend to be more prescriptive, then the policy is in the city plan, so the code can be based on that.
Thank you. I see one hands up. Is Hisham? Sorry if the pronunciation is not right.
No, the pronunciation is perfect. So, thank you very much, Marcus and Rob. I really appreciate it. I came in a little bit late, but I think I caught a very good part of it. I just wanted to add from my own experience, following your invitation to do so. I worked on a project in Saudi Arabia a few years ago, and it was interesting what you mentioned about Oman, the Oman example of how they wanted to instill some Islamic patterns into the design codes. And I remember us finding that we wanted to do incredibly challenging to do that because, well, to cut a long story short, it ended up being purely an elevational exercise. So this whole idea of Islamic urban design codes translated into um, uh, an elevational aesthetic exercise as opposed to a deeper, more meaningful understanding of what Islamic cities were like. But what was particularly fascinating about the project I worked on was exactly the point you mentioned about landscaping, because there was a concerted effort to only include landscaping that was indigenous to the Saudi Arabian context. And that aspect was very, very successful. We were using plants that were that could withstand high salinity, low water, etc. And that one. Thank you.
That's really good to actually hear that. Thanks for sharing that, Hisham. One of the things that you could criticize the Abu Dhabi scheme for is that that code has really, you can see the influence of European and American highway design writ large in the boulevards and the big street sections that you see there. And actually, it didn't really translate the much simpler traditional sort of street patterns, which often are shared surface, just because that's the way that they were always used. And there was a real attempt in that code to take people away from that rather than to find out how to make it work better. And again, although the landscape's a big part of the Abu Dhabi code, it's really fairly conventional, formal street trees, rather than perhaps more imaginative combinations of landscaping and public realm.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think Gary is next, followed by Joe.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Very thought-provoking. And from my personal experience, I just want to reiterate the point about design codes needing to be embedded in a planning system that supports them. I sit on the board of the East Midlands Development Corporation, and we were lucky enough to get Pathfinder funding to do a design code, which were district council wide. But Mace produced them. They did a great job, and there was a lot of public consultation and consultation with landowners and developers as well. But at the end of the day, there just weren't the hooks in the local plan that would support it. So it couldn't be adopted. So it just became a very good sort of background paper or guidance note, but it didn't have any teeth. And I just remember, by contrast, a couple of experiences I had. One was working on the Berlin Stock Exchange for Grimshaw, where it was an international competition that we won, but Berlin has a code that you must have a parapet height of 22 meters, and they would not budge from that. And Frank Gehry came along after us and did a building for a bank in Berlin, and they wouldn't budge for him either. And so they have a cohesiveness in that city. And another experience was working on Chelsea Barracks, where I was interviewed by New York financiers for the consortium I was representing, and they just kept asking me, well, what height can we build to? And I was saying, well, that depends. And they would say, but what's in the code? And they just couldn't get their heads around this idea that there was no code, that it was all negotiation. And they said, well, how can we possibly put a price on the land if we don't know what height we can build the buildings to? So I'll just finish by saying what I think is one of the best design codes I've ever come across, which was a single sentence written by a sultan in medieval times for Marrakesh, which said, all buildings must be red. And that city has since had thousands of buildings built in all different styles, and they're all red, and there's a cohesiveness, apart from Yves Saint Laurent's house, which is bright blue, and his garden, which is bright blue. But I think I raise that not to be flippant, but because sometimes design codes, it comes back to the thing you were saying, Rob, about just being generic good design. It could be the Urban Design Compendium, really. There's a real fear of actually saying, no, this is what we want. And then giving designers huge freedom within that, but saying these are the half dozen things that are really important to us. Providing you do these things, you can be as creative as you like, you can do as much as you like. But we're really scared to do that. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd just endorse what you're saying. The shortest code that we looked at was the Vinegar Lane one. Another reason why it's one of my favorites, it's 20 pages long compared to others which were hundreds of pages long. I mean, it's that you can actually cover so much that's really important to making a distinctive, successful development in just 20 pages is in itself a really good lesson.
And one of the most admired Borneo Sporenburg in the Netherlands, we didn't actually see that code. We saw illustrations for it, but people say, "Oh, that's the basic code is one page." Yeah, so
it was a great development.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Joe, followed by Amy.
Thank you both. I couldn't see any reference in your 10 lessons to the idea that a design code can or could restrict so-called design freedom and might produce monotony. Did you find any evidence in your case studies either for or against this idea?
Well, I think quite a few of the case studies consciously were promoting variety. Again, Vinegar Lane said that right up front that that's what they wanted to do. So variety in terms of materials and colours and so on, design solutions on a plot-by-plot basis. I think the way that we found most commonly address the issue about how do you provide for variety and avoid monotony is this recourse to having a professional design panel to assist and advise on non-compliant or otherwise sort of divergent proposals. So lots of the codes had a built-in structure to allow for an innovative designer or a developer to actually do something a bit different. But I think the majority of them it either relied, for instance, in Western Australia, relied on the fact that they're different owners doing different things in each for their own plot, and therefore, the natural instinct of people to do their own thing and express themselves through their homes, or else they were actually on large-scale developments where it was more on a street-by-street basis. They were trying to get hierarchy and differentiation in that respect, rather than variety for its own sake. Robert, I don't know if you had any other examples that you thought were different for that?
No, not really. It's interesting that monotony, consistency, the different words describing the same thing, and it's a different balance to get. Sometimes you want more consistency, sometimes you want to avoid monotony.
Thank you. Amy?
I don't know if my microphone's working. Is it working? Oh,
Yeah.
brilliant. Lovely. I think it was an interesting point which you covered, which was how much of some of the design codes. I'm doing a lot of design code research at the moment, and I've worked in practice, and I'm working for a local authority at the moment. And how much of it is generic, and it's like best practice, and it's, you know, like quite unusual, often quite dislocated from some of the places where it would apply as well, like especially in some of the areas I've looked at. And they're really well put together and so on as pieces, but they're not really pieces of research. And they're really often really wonderfully illustrated, and you think, and I was just wondering, as someone who used to work in practice, the better projects we seem to produce, well, basically, I think we just about broke even on, because we spent a lot of the time doing that research, and it was usually a lot of like I'd call it proper community consultation. I liked the cartoons of, of course I'm going to go to the design code event, sat in a plastic chair drinking instant coffee. And I just wondered, in terms of commissioning, and it sounds really boring to talk about commissioning in a design meeting, but is it not that in the commissioning people actually just need to actually give sufficient time for that in-depth research to be done, to set up proper community design panels and things like that, and then like actually go and get out in the areas and spend time observing as well, like just how do people use a space? It's a bit like being an anthropologist or something, but without the sort of cold scientific element too much. And just, I think it's that thing of, I'd be interested to know if the difference between those is also in the commissioning, because most consultants, well, they don't want to lose that. That's the profit margin, isn't it? It's the whole existence of their business can diminish because the person who's commissioned the work doesn't understand that actually needs to be done. And maybe that's something that, as commissioners and consultants, needs to be suggested, essentially, because that is where if you get a generic code, you get generic urban settings and the rest of it. So maybe there's something in the commissioning, and maybe that's a thing to focus on, because it's the first thing that happens. And it doesn't matter how skilled the architects are, or the urban designers or landscapers. And again, it's just putting these things into like briefs, and maybe sharing those briefs and things like that, because I'm pretty keen to do that for our local plan growth areas, is make sort of high level design codes, and then and say what goes in and what the process is that's expected for the rest of the design codes from the developers.
I completely agree with what you're saying. I mean, I think it's if you're going to do a design code for a specific area, why not look at, say you're coding the parameters for a detached house or a semi-detached house, for instance. Why not look at where semi-detached houses are working really well in that local area, and actually learn from those. And then it also means it's relevant, and not just to the area, but also is known and understood and familiar to local people. I don't think these have to take a lot of time and effort to do, but I agree they're often not built into programs, not given enough attention.
And I think just what it's good to look at in a code or any design guidance is the one page that says, this is what we found in this place, this is what's important about it, and these are the three most important things that we want the development to reflect. And as you say, often that isn't anywhere, you don't see it, and there's an enormously long document, most of which is generic urban design guidance, which is all good stuff. But that's something very different from a specific code that really is based on the character of the place.
Absolutely. And I think there is a comment related to that into the chat, saying that we almost always hear about is hate. I don't know if it's online, but it's about that we always hear about including culture and community in codes, but I have yet to see how design codes translate these into codes. Anyone have any thoughts or examples of these being successfully implemented? Yeah.
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think we'd all like to see more examples of how that's actually done, because even where people do consultation, you don't get a sense that some really locally distinctive culture or history or association or traditions or local materials or something perhaps get put into design codes, but that's often the limit of it. I'd like to see much more of that. So yeah, if anyone's got any good examples, yeah, really interested.
Great. We are running out of time. Is there any final comments or questions? One more. Do I have time for a last one? Very quick one. Just something that I'm really interesting at design codes for the public sectors. And I was interested in your view, looking at the latest MPPF changes and the focus on design-wide, authority-wide design code not being mandatory anymore. And just if you have a couple of thoughts, what do you think then the future of area-wide design codes could be? I know it's a big question, but if you have one thought.
Can I get my crystal ball out? Yeah.
Please, we need that.
Rob and I were at an event about a week ago about the Earl's Court design code, and we were invited to just hear what they've been doing there, and that was really interesting. But there were people around the table who've been involved much more closely than we have with government and with the ministry and so on, and previously with Office of Place before their demise. And we asked them, during the breakout over coffee, well, what's the latest? Where's government going with this? And they said, we don't know. So even the latest news is nobody knows.
And I think the idea of an area-wide design code is always very odd, because surely a design code is about a specific place, not a wide area. In the same way, we've got a national model design code. Well, how can you have a national model of a design code, which is really good design guidance, but to call it a code makes you think, oh, that's a code. Well, no, that's design guidance, which people are meant to draw on in producing codes. But to me, a code is something specific to a specific place that you can actually define what you want to achieve in that particular, on that site or that small area, but not a whole local authority.
Absolutely, and I guess the area wide is as well where you can define your priorities. The key is not trying to cover everything, but just define then your priority at that scale. I think Adam has a thumb up. Yeah, so that's it. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Rob, and thanks everyone else.
Thank you.
The recording, I think, will be available in a couple of weeks on Urban Nouns. Just I encourage you to check the next event on the Urban Design Group website. We have a film night tomorrow about the white flats, which will be followed by discussion from Joe McCafferty from Levitt Bernstein and Marina Miloshev, which previously was from LLDC. We have another online event on Tuesday, the 11th of February, and it's going to be about how high quality housing can be delivered in well-off areas, and then a book launch. So we have many events, and thanks again. If you have any question about the Urban Design Group, if you like to be involved, please get in touch with us. And thanks again.
Thanks all for coming.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.